Olga Alexandrovna, also known as the last Grand Duchess of Russia. She was born in Peterhof Palace in St. Petersburg and belonged to one of the mightiest dynasties of her time. She grew up in the most sparkling palaces of the Russian Empire. After ending up in a catastrophic arranged marriage that went on to get annulled, Olga was forced to flee her home country during the Russian Revolution. She ended up in Denmark and later in Canada. At the end of her life, Olga lived in a small apartment above a beauty salon in Toronto, where she died in 1960. Her life from living in the biggest palaces to her last home in Canada are the topic of today's video. It was June 13, 1882. It was in Peterhof Palace in St. Petersburg, in the then Russian Empire, when Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna was born. A 101-gun salute announced the birth of a royal baby to the nation. Olga was the daughter of the then Tsar Alexander III and Maria Feodorovna. Her father himself was the son of the assassinated Tsar Alexander II, and her mother was the Danish-born Princess Dagmar. Olga was the sixth and youngest child of her parents. Her eldest sibling was Nicholas, who would later become known as the last Tsar Russia ever had. At a young age, Olga was given into the care of an English nanny. She and her siblings spent most of their childhood in Peterhof Palace, a palace right outside of St. Petersburg. The family was forced to leave St. Petersburg as they were frequent targets for assassination attempts. Just a year before her birth, her own grandfather, Tsar Alexander II, was assassinated when his carriage was bombed. At Peterhof Palace, Olga and her siblings were raised in a simple way. They slept on camp beds, were awoken at 6 a.m., took cold baths, and ate porridge for breakfast. In October 1888, while on their way to the Caucasus, the imperial family's train came off the rails while they were dining. The imperial family managed to escape unharmed, but it is to this day not clear whether this incident was an accident or an assassination attempt. Olga, just like her other siblings, was educated by private tutors. She learned history, geography, and was taught English, French, and Russian. In addition, she received writing lessons, which led to her becoming an expert writer. While her relationship with her mother was strained, Olga was quite close to her father. She would go on hikes with him and was taught woodmanship. So when in November of 1894 the Tsar suddenly died at the age of only 49, 12-year-old Olga was left heartbroken. In 1900, Olga had her first court debut at 18 years old. She would later state that she hated the experience and felt like a caged-up animal. At around the same time, she would begin getting escorted to theaters by her distant cousin, Duke Peter Alexandrovich of Oldenburg. A year later, the 14 years older Peter asked for Olga's hand in marriage. The young Grand Duchess was shocked by the request and simply responded with "thank you." Their wedding followed on August 19, 1901. She spent her wedding night alone, crying, while her husband, who was assumed to be a homosexual, spent the whole night at a gambling club. Their marriage would remain unconsummated. Olga and Peter were gifted a 200-room palace from Nicholas II, Olga's brother. There they would have separate bedrooms at the opposite ends of the building. Unhappy due to their catastrophic marriage, Olga fell into deep depression, which caused her to lose all of her hair. She was therefore forced to wear a wig until her own hair had regrown. Olga spent much of her time helping other people. She would establish schools and hospitals where she was interested in learning medical treatment herself. In 1903, Olga met a guard officer named Nikolai Kolikovsky. She fell head over heels in love with him and asked her husband for a divorce. He declined but appointed Nikolai as an aide-de-camp, letting him live in their household. Living in St. Petersburg, Olga witnessed firsthand how public unrest over time grew. These public unrests, as well as the catastrophic defeat during the Russo-Japanese War, led to the First Russian Revolution in 1905. In 1914, the First World War broke out, and Olga, with her knowledge of medicine, began working as a nurse. In the midst of the war, Olga finally managed to convince her brother Nicholas to annul her marriage to Peter. Shortly after, she married Nikolai Kolikovsky in a small ceremony which was only attended by 2 members of the imperial family. Only a year later, Nicholas II was forced to abdicate during the Russian Revolution. Many members of the Romanov family consequently were put under house arrest by the new dominant regime. Olga, her mother, her sister, and her brother-in-law managed to escape St. Petersburg right in time. They were brought to the Crimea by a special train where they lived at her brother-in-law's estate. Nevertheless, the family was put under house arrest by their local forces. While there, Olga gave birth to her first child named Tikhon. Facing the death penalty and with little to no information on their relatives back in St. Petersburg, Olga's mother, sister, and brother-in-law were evacuated by a warship which was sent by Dowager Queen Alexandra of the United Kingdom. Olga and her husband refused to leave Russia and were able to move to the Caucasus, an area which was partially clear of the revolutionary Bolsheviks. There, the family settled into a farmhouse where Olga gave birth to their second child. Nevertheless, the family was forced out of Russia in late 1919. After a short trip, they settled in Denmark, the home country of Olga's mother. In Denmark, the family lived at the Peterhof Palace together with Olga's mother, the Dowager Empress. Her mother, however, never accepted that Olga married a commoner and was cold towards him. After the death of her mother, Olga purchased a farm outside of Copenhagen. There, the family lived a simple life. Her husband kept horses, and Olga was busy with household chores, working on the fields, and painting. To help her family, Olga later began to sell her paintings. When the Soviets occupied parts of Denmark after the Second World War, Olga grew fearful of possible assassination attempts. The family therefore made the decision to move to Canada in 1948. After arriving in Canada, they bought a farm in Ontario. However, as Olga and her husband Nikolai were almost 70 at that point, the maintenance of the farm became a burden to them. They sold the farm in 1952 and moved into a small house. The once Grand Duchess of Russia was a famous resident in Ontario and frequently received her royal relatives. Nikolai died in 1958, and Olga's health from that point on began to deteriorate. As she was unable to care for herself, she moved into a small apartment above a beauty salon in Toronto, where she stayed with her friends. There, she slipped and fell into a coma in November of 1960. A few days later, the so-called last Grand Duchess of Russia passed away at the age of 78. Olga was interred next to her husband at York Cemetery in Toronto, where they rest until this day.